Okay, so for the next hour, hour and 15 minutes, I'm going to share the work that we do at the Rebecca Center for Music Therapy, which is basically combining a music therapy approach with a developmental relationship-based model. And that's where the floor time model comes in. So here's some of the areas that these are the areas that we will be covering over the next hour or so. I wasn't sure how much experience you all had with autism and music therapy. So I was just going to define these two concepts just to provide a context. Then we'll talk about how music interaction is just like interpersonal interaction. And then that'll roll out the DIR floor time model. I'll quickly define what the D stands for, the I and the R. And then that'll move us into how we do assessment and create a baseline when doing clinical intervention of music therapy. So we'll be, throughout the presentation, I'll be focusing a lot on these different functional, emotional capacities that we'll get into. And we'll use these throughout the presentation in terms of how we assess and understand where the child is developmentally. And then I'll show video supporting these ideas and talk about how floor time and music therapy work together. Okay. But before we get started, I was just curious to know, just to get a little bit of an idea of who you all are. You can put it into the chat. You know, which discipline are you? All psychologists or music therapists, parents, and how much experience have you had with autism? Started, let's just, since we're going to be contextualizing the course or the presentation within autism, I just want to, this may be familiar for everyone, or maybe you don't have a lot of experience with autism, or I just wanted to define some key constructs. So based on the latest DSM manual, the diagnostic manual, autism is a disorder that mainly impacts someone's ability to relate and communicate. Doesn't mean that autistic people cannot relate and communicate. It mainly means that maybe they have challenges in these areas through a range of experience, through a range of emotion. So if we take the DSM and we funnel it into one page, we can think of autism as these areas coming up here. Challenges in social interaction, peer relationships, challenges in the area of sharing interests and achievements with other people, challenges in the ability to be emotionally reciprocal, and challenges in the ability to initiate and sustain ideas and interactions. So if we see that most of these areas are challenges in interaction and social communication, we want to find an intervention that will address these things. And so music therapy, I think, speaks to each of those areas. But maybe for some of you, music therapy is a new, you're not familiar with the intervention. So I just put a general definition here of what a music therapist is. So music therapy is an evidence-based practice in which the music therapist provides musical experiences within the context of a relationship to achieve therapeutic goals. So music therapists have clinical goals. We conduct assessments. It's very different than music education. So the music therapist is not teaching music. We're not teaching instruments or songs. We're providing musical experiences for clients with the idea to target clinical goals. Very different from music education. Music education is focused on teaching music, teaching how to read music, teaching how to play an instrument. So where one is more about music activities, the other in music therapy is more about providing musical experiences. In music therapy, we have four main methods, which really equate to four main experiences of music that we can provide. There's clinical improvisation, in which the therapist and client are spontaneously making music together. There's songwriting, in which the therapist and client are composing a song together. There's receptive music experiences where the client is actively listening to music. This might be found in a hospital using receptive music for pain management, or say guided imagery of music. And then there's recreative music experiences in which the therapist and client are recreating a song. This could be a pre-composed song that they're engaging in. The two primary methods that we work with at the Rebecca Center are improvisation and songwriting. And both of those methods I'll highlight throughout the presentation. So how does a typical session look? So basically, the clients do not need to know how to play music. They do not need to be trained in music. We have a variety of instruments available for the clients to play. And these are mostly percussive instruments, drums, tambourines, or xylophone, bells, things that do not require musical skill. It's up to the music therapist to then create music experiences around what the client is doing, to then make it relational, to make it communicative. So if a client comes in and is hitting a drum in a certain way, and is not really sure what to do with this drum, the therapist may provide a melody along with it, right? So if the client is playing like, now maybe the therapist is gonna follow the client's lead and go la da 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 da. So when we bring melody to the percussion, it automatically makes it relational and communicative, in which we're trying to foster this reciprocity, this two-way purposeful communication. So mainly what the therapist is doing is enhancing the music of the client by following his or her lead and bringing them into a related experience. Okay. And so, as I said, mainly we work improvisationally. And so these are some of the critical features of how we're presenting the music. The first thing is following the child's musical lead. So no matter what the child is doing in the room, we're trying to meet affect and provide an opportunity for them to engage with us. Once we have engagement, then we try to facilitate two-way purposeful communication, right? The therapist may start playing faster or louder, or change the music in a way and see how the client responds to that. Then once we have two-way purposeful communication, we try to expand the play. So the music can then start to modulate and get bigger and becomes multi-dimensional. And I'll show videos to highlight these areas. Pull out the DIR model. So the D in DIR is for developmental. So it's a developmental framework. And we're trying to understand where clients are developmentally and to work within those developmental capacities and strengthen their challenges as well as their already strengths. So the developmental portion is trying to understand where they are developmentally. The individual differences for I, these are the things that get in the way of the child's ability to move up the developmental ladder. Right? And then finally, relationship-based. We want to understand their mode of relating and also embed all of our interactions within a social context. So it's not so prescribed. It's more about what's happening organically in the moment. So for developmental, we're looking at these 6 areas, right? And these are based on neurotypical development. So for a neurotypical baby from 0 to 3 months, they develop the capacity to self-regulate and show interest in the world. What this means is that taking all of the senses that are happening in their environment, integrating the senses while still being available for interaction, and the senses being, auditory input, tactile input, proprioception, vestibular input, all of these things that the brain is integrating simultaneously while being available for interaction. And we see with a lot of the kids that we work with, that they have challenges in this area of the ability to self-regulate. If a child has a hard time with self-regulation, they're going to have a hard time with engagement. And if they're having a hard time with engagement, it's going to be very challenging to get into communication, communicative experience with them. So we're looking at their ability to self-regulate and be available for interaction. This then takes us, can they engage with us in an affective or emotional way? So from say 3 months to say 7 or 8 months, a neurotypical baby develops the ability to engage and become attached to their caregivers. The next milestone is two-way purposeful communication, in which there's a reciprocity that's happening between the child and caregiver, or in this case, therapist. From about 2 years, or say 3 years old, they start to develop their ability to engage in shared problem solving. This is where language starts to develop in neurotypical kids. And they're able to sustain multiple circles of communication and problem solve with a caregiver through a range of emotional experiences. This is where symbolism starts to develop within neurotypical kids. And then that leads to about 3.5 years where they're develop the ability to engage in creating ideas, pretend play, and get into abstract thinking. And then finally, bridging ideas. Bridging ideas is the ability to take multiple abstract ideas through a range of emotion and be able to connect them. So this is the deep portion of the model for developmental. When we're working with our clients, we want to get an understanding of why something is happening in terms of their behavior. You know, what's getting in his or her way. And so we try to understand what's happening to that sensory system. And to that end, we want to create a sensory profile. And this is where the individual differences would come up. So these are the things that get in the way of the child's ability to move up the developmental ladder. And here are just some of the individual differences that come up. Their ability to motor plan and sequence might get in their way of interacting. Auditory processing, you know, what is their receptive and expressive ability when engaged in interaction. We look at their visual spatial processing. Visual spatial processing has nothing to do with you know, your vision in terms of 20/20 vision, or like, do you need glasses? It's more about how the brain is processing what the eyes see. And so if you see a child who bumps into things a lot, and people say, oh, he's just clumsy. But really, it could be that their depth perception, they're having a hard time understanding how close and far away they are from certain things, or how their eyes focus or do not focus when they get closer to objects and move away from objects. And then finally, sensory modulation and sensory processing. We want to understand how these things are being integrated. You know, and in here you have your tactile, which is, you know, how we feel things in our bodies. We have proprioception, how the joints are taking in information when walking or jumping or bouncing. Vestibular system, how we know where our body is in space. Without a vestibular system, we would always fall down, right? So these are just some of the areas, the sensory areas. And sometimes we see clients that are hypo-responsive to these sensory stimuli. And sometimes we see clients that are hyper-responsive to it. So they crave it in order to be regulated. And so the idea is to understand where they are, where their individual differences are, so we can support these differences within the context of interaction to help move them up the developmental ladder. If that makes sense, because I spoke a lot. I said a lot of things. Finally, relationship-based. This is the most important component of the model, I believe. The idea here is that we want to provide the experiences within the context of relationship. We believe that building rapport with the clients is very important. And we provide all of the interventions through this. In this case, it's music therapy, right? But what's great about DIR is that it's inclusive of all disciplines: speech therapy, psychology, occupational therapy. So even though we're working the intervention all in a different way, we're working towards the same thing, we're working towards the same areas. And we're providing our discipline within the context of relationship. So things that are happening in the moment are purely organic. And then the therapist there is constantly shifting in and out, trying to facilitate relating and communicating within the context of relationship. Right. So that's the D, the I, and the R. Now we have the floor time portion of it. So the floor time piece is the actual intervention. It's how we deliver the intervention. So floor time is an evidence-based child-led approach that's used to promote developmental milestones with children, adults, and even young adults. It's a philosophy of how to apply an intervention. As I said earlier, it's all disciplines can work within this. I'm a trainer in floor time, and so the training I've done includes all of the health-related disciplines, including education too. And so how it works is like what I said earlier. We're observing the child in the room, and while doing this, try to understand what's happening and then follow their lead. The purpose of following their lead is to try to join their interests and meet their affect for multiple reasons. One is to provide empathy, no matter what they're doing. Right? And then to provide an experience that's meeting their affect, that's empathetic, that can facilitate engagement. Because engagement's the start of any interaction, right? Once we have engagement, we want to try to expand the play and see if we can get circles of communication. Circles of communication can be defined in the following. Let's say, I come on this presentation and I say, hello, everyone, how are you doing? So I opened a circle of communication. And then maybe somebody comes back and says, I'm doing fine. That person then closed the circle. Now we just completed one circle. But let's say someone else said, I'm doing fine, but how are you? So they closed the circle and then opened another circle of communication. And then I come in saying, I'm not doing that good today. My back hurts, my hands hurt, but I'll get through the day. I have to go to work now. What are you doing today? So there I closed the circle and then opened the circle. So the idea with floor time is that we want to do this to create multiple back and forth circles of communication. And so in the example I just gave, that was done through language. But we can do this with any media. It could be with say a toddler, and you have a ball and you roll the ball to the toddler and the toddler gets the ball. So I opened the circle of communication and the toddler closed the circle by holding the ball. So now what is he or she going to do with the ball? Maybe he rolls it back. Oh, okay. So now he opened a circle of communication and I caught it. And now we have engagement. We just opened and closed two circles. And now I want to expand the play. And maybe I pretend I'm going to throw it, but I don't. And they're anticipating it. And then they make a sound to try to get me to roll the ball back. And I do that. So now we have more complex circles of communication, right? And so in music, what we saw in the previous video, we saw multiple circles of communication happening between myself, the child, the student who was on the side, right? The communication consisted of musical communication. It consisted of nonverbal communication through social referencing, right? And through all the dynamical play that happened in the music. So this is the floor time piece of DIR. So the D, the I, and the R, gives us the how we conceptualize the child and informs how we are going to intervene, which is the floor time piece. So Why music and floor time? So as we saw in the video, musical interaction is interaction. If a child can do that in music and activate those sensory systems, I believe they could do that outside of music. People think many years ago, 20, 30 years ago, people thought that there was a part of the brain that was dedicated to music. It was isolated just for music. We know now that that's not true. We know now in neuroscience that when people listen to music, play music, or even think about music, the brain lights up like a pinball machine. And so there are parts of the brain that are lighting up that have to do, say, the amygdala, which is all about emotion, or the cerebral cortex, that is all about motor movements and motor planning. So how the brain is talking to each other when you're navigating in the world. There are many similarities to what's happening in a musical interaction, right? I think as musicians or non-musicians, I'm sure everybody listens to music. We might take music for granted and not realize that it's something that it's much more than just for listening pleasure, right? So as we saw in the previous video, how interactive music can facilitate co-regulation, social communication, as well as all the pre-verbal things that go on in music making, the emotional signaling, the gestures, how to interpret musical cues and integrate this. These are all core features of autism that I think just naturally come out in music. So what we saw there, if we go back to these levels, right? We saw Tyler expanded his range of self-regulation, meaning that he was available for the interaction. But me and the teacher there are generating a lot of affect, her through her facial affect, me through my vocal affect. And what we're doing is harnessing affect, to keep them interested and engaged. And so then we saw him engage. We also saw a lot of very robust two-way purposeful communication. There was call and response. There were times then when I wanted to slow the music down to see if he could modulate his system, because he was so amped. The music was really fast, really fast, really fast, and then it comes back down. So can he then modulate his emotional system to come back down with us? We saw some islands of shared problem solving. When the music changed a little, he then figured things out, but still wasn't a lot, but we did see capacities in those areas. Here's some other areas that we saw and heard, so the music therapist there's following and expanding and challenging him musically. We saw social cues. We saw him reach out with his hands. So we saw some body affect, gestures, right? And then if we look at the sensory system, there were a lot of things happening at the same time sensorially, visual, auditory, tactile, etc. And it's all being responded to in a tempo-based manner. Right? There were some moments, though, where he waited, or we waited for him to respond. That could have been a processing delay on his part. But I also think sometimes he was playing with us, right? I'm not too sure. But either way, the music waits for him in some way. So then he realizes, hopefully, that we're not going to move on without him. So again, thinking about this idea that musical interaction brings together all of these conventional domains. Think about the videos we saw, or just think about with people making music, and think about the domain areas that are being tapped into, right? All happening within the context of music. Motor skills are happening. There's cognition going on, and the musical cognition would reveal itself in understanding the musical patterns, the predictability, right? The sequencing of the sounds, that's all cognition. And the communicative portions of it, we saw through different, we saw nonverbal singing, we saw social cues. So what I'm getting at is all of these things are being realized within the musical interaction. And so this is an idea that I've been working on, is thinking about how music can be its own domain of health. So now I want to break out those 6 areas of functional, emotional, developmental levels that we talked about earlier that fall under the D. So we break these out here, and we'll see level 1 is self-regulation. So these are the areas that we're looking at and trying to understand the client's ability to self-regulate, their ability to focus, ability to be calm during the interaction, their availability for interaction, right? How they take in information from the experience. Information meaning the visual input, the auditory input, all of these different things that are happening during interaction. So that's how we would define self-regulation. Level 2, sorry, let me fix my screen. Level 2, engagement. This is the client's ability to engage in relational interactions in an emotionally connected way. And so what we're looking for here is that ability to do so, but also looking, can they do this within a range of emotional experiences? Like some kids can only respond to music that's really fast, loud, and it's just generating a lot of emotional, lot of affect. But then when the music becomes soft and maybe more connected and more flowing, maybe they withdraw, right? Or it could be the other way around. So we're trying to assess them through a range of emotional experiences. That would be level 2. Level 3 is two-way purposeful communication. And this is the ability to transform emotions into signals for communication. And they understand, read, and respond to the caregiver's signals or the therapist's signals, right? And when the therapist challenges the child, can they understand this and then respond accordingly to make the interactions more spontaneous? So then through these exchanges, we're hoping that the child begins to engage in rapid back and forth emotional signaling that we call two-way personal communication. And this here, I believe, is a prerequisite to verbal communication. This would be all of the gestural ways that we communicate that lead to the ability to use words. Okay, so let's move on to individual differences. How do we address this? So there's these biological differences, right? And that's maybe some of the sensory challenges that get in the child's way. Things that the nervous system is having a hard time with that then result in certain types of behavior. So we want to understand that. We don't want to respond to every behavior in a punitive way because it could be a nervous system or a biological issue that we need to learn about. Once we determine that, we want to understand their musical differences. In other words, what do the musical conditions have to be in order for them to maximize their ability to interact? So this informs the music therapist's music. So if a child is more responsive to fast and loud, we might start off with fast and loud music. But then eventually we want to be able to provide them with more three-dimensional ways of interacting in music through a range of the musical elements of tempo, of how fast it is and how loud something is. Because I think that mirrors life. If you can only do something when the conditions are just right, what are you going to do in the world when those conditions cannot be met, say outside? And so that's what we're trying to do, is to maximize the interaction through a range of experiences. Okay. Let's move on to level 4. So level 4, so we already talked about self-regulation, level 1, engagement, level 2, two-way purposeful communication, level 3, and now level 4, complex communication and shared problem solving. So this capacity is all about learning to interact while solving problems. In this sense, the child developing a sense of self too, because now he or she realizes they have an impact in the world. So their ability for cause and effect relationships is starting to happen now. And they might seek help to get something, which maybe it's to get food or to get a toy or whatever that might be. And so the way this might manifest in play interactions such as music is that the child is now able to open and close many circles of communication and is now establishing rapid back and forth rhythms with the caregiver using different media for expression, so facial expressions, gestures, sounds, right? So there's a lot of different things that are happening while solving a problem. Because, you know, sometimes some kids, when they want something and they don't get it right away, they might melt down. So the idea here is that we want to try to help them develop the ability to tolerate waiting and to understand that things change and how do you adapt to those things. Moving on now to level 5. So level 5 is the use of symbols and creating emotional ideas. Here's where pretend play comes into fruition. And eventually, you know, language then comes into symbols, right? And then words take on 3 dimensions. And then that leads to more complex ways of using language. And this, I would say, is probably the precursor for empathy, right? Because without symbolic thinking, it's going to be impossible to develop the ability to abstract. And without abstraction, one cannot provide empathy, in my opinion. So here, pretend play is used to symbolize real or imagined events, the use of symbols to manipulate ideas in the person's mind without actually having to carry out the actions, right? Flexibility in reasoning, thinking, and problem solving, etc. Back to the way things used to be, but that's not happening, you know? And so the point of this video is to show he's now connecting ideas and he's becoming more abstract. And I think the way he's emoting the music is showing some anger. Because prior to this, the music was always very well contained and his range of affect was limited. But he can engage in conversations. It was just that the words that he would choose to use were not so abstract. He was very fact-based, so to speak, right? And so this then takes us to here. So in this, that last excerpt was a songwriting method. And so here, as I said earlier, he's expressing a range of emotion, you know, through vocal, you know, and through lyrics. You see the variation of the range, which is dynamics, is how loud and soft, the difference of his vocal sounds, his timbre, his vocal affect. And the music is just trying to support him and create a portrait of the emotional landscape that I'm sensing, you know. Let's do a time check. Show one more video. So level 6 is bridging ideas. So where level 5, the pretend play and symbolism, is about generating and communicating emotional ideas. Level 6 is about building bridges between emotional ideas. So there, I think, is a good example of level 5 and 6. Right? He's bridging ideas. He's taking something that was precomposed, right, making it into something of his own that's related to something that he's feeling and thinking about. And then I'm just there to support, you know, and provide a lot of affect. Because again, the key thing with floor time is that we're mobilizing affect to help elongate interactions and make them more complex. So that's the presentation. And here's some resources if you're interested in learning more about the Rebecca Center for Music Therapy. And then the other developmental music health, music therapy, if you wanted to know more about LDIR. And floor time trainings happen. That's ICDL, that's the Interdisciplinary Council for Development and Learning. And here's my email address if you have any questions or would like, you know, further information. I can get the slides to you, or Sonia, I think, could probably send them out at some point. But thank you, and thank you for having me, Anna and Sonia and the association. I really appreciate the opportunity to share ideas, and hopefully we'll meet one day. That'd be great. If you come to New York, let me know. And if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. I'd be more than happy to help. Thank you very much.